Good afternoon. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats as we proceed to our second panel. This panel is addressing the subject, arguing with non-skeptics. I was going to join this panel to discuss my own technique, but I left my baseball bat home. So therefore, I will allow more time to the other speakers. And this panel will be hosted by Julia Galef, who is a journalist and editor based here in New York, who writes about science, religion, and culture for a wide variety of publications, including Science and The Humanist. And if you have tuned in, and if you have not yet, we hope you will, to the podcast of the New York City Skeptics, Rationally Speaking. Hey, there you go. Excellent, very good. She is the host, co-host, along with Massimo Piucci, and also a blogger at the site. She identifies herself as a devoted member. That's an interesting use of that term, considering the company, but we take it in the best way, a devoted member of New York City Skeptics. And we are very, very pleased to have her here today to moderate Arguing with Non-Skeptics. Please welcome Julia Galef.
Jamie, thanks for the introduction. It's so good to be here. As Jamie said, I encourage you all to check out Rationally Speaking, the official podcast of New York City Skeptics. It wasn't in the program for some reason. It got left out. I can only assume that the reason was that the SGU people got a little threatened by the competition, which, it's understandable, but, there's room for two guys, just saying. So I was actually, the previous NECSS was my first, it was last fall, and it was my first encounter with the organized skeptic movement here in New York, and it was pretty exciting. So as you can imagine, I'm really thrilled to be up here on stage today talking to you. And I'm also thrilled to introduce our panelists today. First up, we have Steve Mirsky. He developed the weekly Scientific American podcast, the magazine's foray into web-based broadcasting. He hosts the program and launched, give it up, Steve Mirsky. He also launched the daily Scientific American podcast, 60 Second Science, which he produces and often hosts. The programs were nominated for 2007 Webby Award. Congrats. Mirsky also writes the anti-gravity column for Scientific American and is a member of the magazine's board of editors. He also writes for a bunch of other publications and broadcast outlets, including Audubon, Wildlife Conservation, National Wildlife, Earth, Longevity, The Humanist, and other periodicals. Mirsky received his master's in chemistry from Cornell in 1985 and was awarded a mass media fellowship by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He was awarded science journalism fellowships at the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole and received a Knight Science Journalism Fellowship at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Next up, George Hrab. Coming out, George Hrab. If you stayed during lunch, you would have been treated to the dulcet tones and razor-sharp wit of George Hrab's songs. But if you were unfortunate enough to miss that, George is a multi-instrumentalist, singer, songwriter, skeptic, podcaster, producer, composer, and heliocentrist. He's been asked multiple times to be a featured performer at James Randi's The Amazing Meeting in Vegas. He was a special guest performer in the Galapagos on the JRAF's Amazing Adventure, and the first American to present at TAM London. He also produces a weekly award-winning podcast called The Geologic Podcast, which features humor, sketches, music, and skeptical, free-thinking commentary. He wrote the theme song to the 365 Days of Astronomy podcast, and his occasional songs for the periodic table, a 118-part song cycle featuring a song for each element, has been described as the first true geek symphony. George is considered one of the preeminent skeptic, science, atheist, geek culture, music icons currently living in his apartment. Well done, George. It was a tight race, that one.
Top two.
And our remaining two panelists, you guys have already had the pleasure of meeting. Come on out, DJ Grothe. DJ. And James Randi. So as Jamie mentioned, the topic of the panel is arguing with non-skeptics. And I chose this topic because I suspect that many of us, maybe most of us here today, have found ourselves mired in these debates in which logic and reason and truth are all on our side, and it's not doing us a bit of good. You guys know these debates. You know what they're like. You lay out your arguments. It's perfectly clear. You go from A to B to C. It's just so clear. And then the person you're talking to is just completely unmoved. And you just want to make this face, which A is not very becoming, and B is not very productive. So we're lucky enough to have on stage here some of the best and the brightest, not just in skeptical thinking, but in skeptical communication, in engaging with the public and convincing people of the skeptic viewpoint. So I'd like to take advantage of these seasoned veterans and talk about what they've learned over the years in arguing with non-skeptics, what tactics they use, what tactics the non-skeptics use and how to cope with those tactics, traps you've fallen into in the past, and how you actually change someone's mind. So to start off, I'd like to know, are there any topics that you actually prefer not to debate, that you'd just as soon avoid, whether that's because debating them would be pointless or possibly even harmful?
Kirk versus Picard is a very, very touchy thing. I try to avoid. See, it's already starting. No, sorry. I don't think there should be any subjects that I know religion tends to be kind of the elephant in the room very often, and when you start debating those kinds of things. But I'm always up for a conversation, which I think is the most important thing to remember when you're having a discussion with gigantic ironic quotes around it. A conversation with someone is to make it a conversation. I think that's essential. You sort of touched on this idea of not falling into the trap of thinking the person you're talking to is an idiot because they might believe something idiotic. That's something that I never want to avoid. The most idiotic topic in our mind, in your mind, in one's mind, can be discussed on some level, I would think. And I can't think of something I wouldn't want to talk about.
I agree. I think no questions should be off limit. No issues are taboo for the skeptic. But a further point, I'm not sure, and maybe I'm anticipating some further conversation in our panel, but I'm not sure the goal should always be to argue with our cultural competitors. Instead, maybe our target market is the people they're talking to, the people they're trying to persuade. We can talk to those people, try to persuade them as well. And so even at a skeptics meeting, at lunch, we were discussing that at one skeptics group, there are a few taboo topics: global warming, politics, and religion. Now, those are three of my favorite things to talk about, right? That said, I think from an organizational standpoint, it makes sense to say, look, here's our focus, let's talk about these topics, that's why we're coming together. But if you're talking about challenging the credulous, nothing should be taboo, nothing.
I agree with that. I think that's exactly what I would have said had I thought of it and gotten to speak before you did, DJ.
Yeah, and you'll notice I looked to you in deference, and yeah.
I noticed, but hello? Your idea of deference, I don't know. I have to argue with that. But I got the worst microphone in history here. It doesn't follow any of my
Just as we
instructions.
planned, yeah.
All right, I'll just do this then. No, I don't think there should be anything off limits for a discussion of this nature. I think we would stifle ourselves. There'll be some subjects that won't be as amenable to discussion in that respect, but I don't think there is any subject that should be off limits.
I disagree just a little bit in that I think it depends on how you feel on a particular day. I mean, if I go to a picnic and I meet new people and turns out that they don't accept the fact of evolution, I got to ask myself, do I really feel like getting into this? And, it might not be worth it on that particular day. But if you're in a feisty mood, sure, go for it. Have fun.
Well, so that actually does anticipate my follow-up question, which is, what about contexts? Are there any contexts or maybe debate formats that you just think are better avoided? I've heard some people say that TV is that's not our comparative advantage in talking about these things. But then, of course, it does reach a wide audience. So what do you think?
Well, I would never debate a creationist. I just wouldn't get on the stage with a creationist. I think that the visual of the science person and the creationist on the stage together means you've already lost. I understand that Michael Shermer does it a lot, and he must enjoy it at some level. But when I give advice to academics who might be faced with the possibility of doing a debate, I just tell them not to do it. The person you're debating is an expert debater. They're an expert at rhetoric. They're not an expert in the science because there is no science. And you will lose that debate because you only have an hour or 2 hours. So just don't do it.
And you validate the creationist by arguing with the creationist,
Right.
I think. I think that gives him or her, a prestige that they wouldn't normally have.
But does it build in an excuse then that is it worth them having the ability to say, well, they won't even talk to us? Is that worth the weight of being sort of losing?
That's the rub on the
That's
thing,
the
of
rub,
course.
right.
Yes.
I think it may make sense for distinguished scientists not to debate these cultural questions or these questions with our cultural competitors. But their charge, of course, is that the scientists are an unelected elite who close off these important issues from debate. So I probably disagree with some of the other panelists. If you're talking about the context of a formal debate in front of an audience, I would love someone steeped in evolution to be able to have a conversation. Now, if it's going to be a debate as opposed to a discussion where people are earnestly inquiring after the truth, then maybe you shy away from that because the deck is stacked against you. But I've been involved with a number of debates on many of these important questions where the opposition, they're not just looking for the gotcha moment. They actually want to engage. They're not all going to pull dirty tricks. So I think it gets to the question of context. Formal debates, I like them. Even in the biology classroom, I want little Johnny to come with his best creationist arguments, and when that unit of the curriculum is up, when that's happening, I want Johnny to say, here's what I believe, and I want the teacher to say, here's what we think the best evidence in science says, and let that kid go home and say, Mom and Dad, I really stuck it to them, because that kind of conversation I think is important. Otherwise, they have every right to say, we're being stifled. We're not even allowed to talk about what we know is the truth. I think that maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I think the best ideas rise to the top, and I have maybe some faith in public debate. Yeah.
There is a construct of a public debate that can be difficult to deal with, where someone knows how to debate, and it doesn't matter what the issue is. They can sort of push their point. I think most people don't get put into that kind of a context. Most of you sitting out there, when you deal with a question of debating with a creationist, it's maybe at a holiday, a family gathering, or maybe on a street corner, or wherever it would be, where it's not in the guise of you have 10 minutes and then you have 2 minutes to respond, and then it's very rarely set up that way. And I think those are very important to be able to open up and talk, have very different ideas. So maybe the cards do tend to be stacked, or the deck tends to be stacked against you in a debate setting, but not. I wouldn't want to discourage anyone from thinking, well, you're a creationist, then I'm not going to talk to you.
Because the real debate has been going on for 150 years. Right. It's in all the scientific journals. But you can't gather that information in this kind of a context. So that's why I'm just very leery of it.
Tough.
So clearly, they do have plenty of, as Steve said, dirty tricks that they can pull out. But what if a scientist were actually trained in debate? Are these dirty tricks just completely unwinnable against, or is there some way to actually counter them and thereby take advantage of this platform to get the truth out?
Well, it also depends very much on the quality of the audience and the background of the audience. You can walk out in front of an audience who will agree with everything you say and disagree with everything that the other person says. So you have to find out how they were selected. For example, years ago I did a program for Grothe TV, James Randi, Psychic Investigator. That didn't mean that I was psychic. It meant that I was an investigator of psychics, but they chose to phrase it that way. And I wondered why the audience was a studio audience hardly this size, probably about 45, 50 people in the audience, studio audience again, and it was being taped with what they call live taping, no editing being done. And I wondered why they were so antagonistic to me. You could tell from the body language is mostly this kind of a thing, and you knew that they were not going to accept very happily what you said. But then I found out how they had chosen the audience. There is a magazine, it's similar to one published in this country called Time Out, and they ran an ad in there saying, "Are you interested in true psychic phenomena? Then apply to be a member of the audience when Grothe TV tapes James Randi, Psychic Investigator." That attracted all the cuckoos. They all showed up. They were outside the studio in droves, most of them with the passes, the tickets that they had, most of them without them, a lot of them without them, pardon me. But they just jammed that studio and stood around the sides of the studio, and they hated my guts. They hated everything I said. So it was stacked against me in the first place, so I warned you about that.
Julia, I think what you're focusing really on is the science communication question versus just the science education question. You could be schooled in evolutionary theory and be able to communicate that very well in a classroom of students who are ready to learn it. But there's a different skill set that's required to engage people who don't already buy it or who don't want to learn it. And so not every scientist is cut out for debate, but I think there are some scientists or science communicators that we should never say, well, in principle, it's just bad to debate it. Instead, let the good debaters debate it, let the bad debaters research it, and I think that's a good solution.
It's also being able to realize that, like is said all the time, no amount of evidence will convince a true believer. So you're not going for the people that believe, you're going for the ones that might have a sliver of doubt. You're going for the ones that aren't necessarily sure. That's always my target audience. If I'm speaking to someone, I'm never going to convince someone that is, fully believing in whatever they're believing in, whatever the woo is. But maybe someone's going to hear this conversation that I'm having with this person, and they'll think, yeah, wait a minute, what is that? How does that work? Why is that way? That always seemed weird to me. And then, in the same way that they preach their wedge teaching, we have our wedge of doubt. And the wedge of doubt is so important. And that's where I think almost everyone's experience in this room, probably, for those of you that might have been believers at one point, it all started with that splinter of doubt, where you might have read something, heard something, seen something, heard a conversation, whatever it was. And I think that's what our job often as debaters is just to find that 2%, 5%, 10% of the audience that's kind of, has the puppy face, yes, that person, that's what I'm talking to right now.
And I ask you to beware if you have to answer a question. If the response starts out as, "That's a very good question," that means you're dead. Because they've already got a prepared answer that goes on for at least 8 paragraphs and more, and it's all rehearsed, and they know it word for word with the punctuation and such. You know you're dead at that point.
That's a very good point.
I have 3 questions that have occurred to me over the years and most of the debates that I run into are at informal gatherings. And the first one is, do you get most of your information from Fox News? Because we want to know, what the grounding in reality is. The second question is, why do you think that? Where are you hearing this? What has made you think what you do? And the third question is there anything that I can say that would change your mind? Can you think of anything that if I said it, it would make an impact on you? And if there's nothing, then you might as well just go back to the bar and get another drink.
Yes, I heard this from Martin Gardner many years ago, one time when he came up with this really bright idea, what you just said, Steve. If the fellow looks at you, and if you ask whoever it is you're debating, what would change your mind on that angle? If they can't answer that, I mean, that's a very telling question right there. And Martin Gardner came up with that idea, and I thank him for it. I've used it many, many times since. And if they can't answer that question, or if they say, oh, nothing will change my mind, then you've won a great point right there.
I mean, the most famous example is probably Haldane, the great evolutionary biologist, was asked, what would convince you that evolution isn't true or didn't happen? And he said, a rabbit in the Precambrian. If you find rabbit fossils that are 700 million years old, I have to go get a new job. But other than that, I'm sticking to what I have here.
Or admit that rabbits are older than you thought.
That's another possibility.
And to have those answers ready too, because that might get turned around on you also. Well, what would it take for you to not believe that, and be able to say that kind of an example or whatever the issue is. And that's the first thing you should be saying to yourself anyway as a skeptic. When you come to believe something or when you come to accept something as being as truthful as it can possibly be under all this. I know we have these caveats that what is truth, but that's the first thing you should be saying. Okay, what would it take for me to think something different? Because we all have our biases in some way or another,
Just one quick comment on the context question and should we debate. It depends on what you're trying to get out of it. Steve's initial point is, look, if you're in a formal debate in front of an audience, what's the phrase I learned playing spades? Don't send a boy to do a man's job, right? You send a good debater, right? But sometimes you're not debating even to win, because frankly, some of us like to debate just because it's fun. Skeptics just want to engage. Like, skeptics in the pub in St. Louis, we started a new group last summer. Over 100 people some months show up at the pub conveniently across the street from the high-rise where we live, and the bartender that she is kind of new age. Well, ain't nobody in the skeptics in the pub thinking they're going to persuade her or convert her or get her to join her club. They're just rabid about the fun prospect of engaging in debating. So it really depends on what you're trying to get out of it. Formal debates, I understand this pushback, this criticism, but sometimes you just want to debate because it's hella fun, right?
On our Caribbean cruise that we just completed recently, remember the lady with the pink hair?
Yes.
What was her name again? I'm sorry.
Maria.
Maria, of course.
Herbeck,
Of course.
yeah.
Thank you.
Beautiful story. Yeah.
Thank you very much. No, it was an excellent case, something that really turned me around in my tracks. She turned out to be a Reiki practitioner.
On the JREF cruise.
On the JREF cruise, yes, of all things. And she was also into homeopathy. And we had a lot of conversations back and forth, and she looked a little distressed, and she didn't show up for one day entirely. And then she showed up looking a little baggy-eyed and such. She had a very bad night and such. And she sat me down and she told me, she says, you've turned me around completely. She said, I'm going to throw away all that literature that I've been handing out to my patients, such, and I'm going to try to get more realistic about it. That's a victory. This is a hallelujah moment, folks. I mean, well, not really hallelujah, but close enough. Close enough for all purposes.
Hal Bidlack.
It should be said, Maria Mirbeck runs a blog. You should Google it, Fledgling Skeptic. So this story of her being a believer and turning into a skeptic is recounted on a blog. I think we'd all dig reading.
Yeah, and we did it. We did it. On that cruise, can you believe it? Out in the middle of the ocean. Damn, that's a victory.
It's also fun to kind of watch people sort of work themselves into pretzels too, describing what they believe. When you get a homeopathist or someone who buys a cold remedy that says, well, it's got homeopathy, and you say, how does that work? and then just watch as the noodles kind of coalesce and then get worked into this thing. And I've said this on my podcast recently, one of the best things you can say is, really?
Just leave it.
Explain that. And then they'll go, well, because it's, it's the energy, and really? And what happens with the energy? Well, it's coming from, a place of, really? And then let them get sort of stuck. And you're not even debating at that point. It's just they realize, wait a minute, yeah,
George, you should get into show business, you know.
think?
You do this very well.
Really?
George, I think the sarcasm is dripping down off the table and
sorry.
pooling into the audience.
Sorry.
But that actually reminds me of another question I had, which was, do you think that this, I'm really interested in techniques for sort of getting people to lower their automatic defenses that they have against our arguments. And so I would think that the asking questions instead of making arguments might be a good way to do that, to sort of lead people to a conclusion without them feeling like you inserted it into or were trying to insert it into their brain. Do you use that technique a lot, the rest of you?
Being friendly is so effective, and it might seem counterintuitive. And there are times that you just want to throttle this person because they're not thinking clearly. But being friendly, and it also is nice because that counteracts their expectations of what you are as someone who's an atheist personally. Just for me personally, when I say I'm an atheist, the best response I got once I was in a gym, I was working out and had this conversation with someone and said I was going to this Christmas Vespers, and he said, "Oh, Christmas Vespers are beautiful." And I said, "Yeah, I enjoy going even though I'm an atheist." And he looked at me and he said, "You're an atheist, but you work out all the time." I said, "Yeah." And he said, what do you do when you're sad?" I'm like, "What do you do when you're sad?" I said, but that was the idea of like an atheist would just be this sad person who doesn't use a treadmill.
Well, how often do atheists get this expression? You must have a very sad life.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right.
You get this all the time. They can't believe that anyone can be happy and be. I'm not saying that you should all be atheists. Remember, we're not an atheist organization, right? Right, DJ? Okay, but.
I'm nodding just as we rehearsed beforehand.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. I appreciate your responses, yes. But no, it is true. They really can't believe that you can be happy being a skeptic and or an atheist. They can't believe it. Why would you go through your life doubting everything? No, I'm not a cynic, I'm a skeptic. Let's get the terminology right here.
So be nice and represent.
Yeah, because you know the old saying, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. Right. Although I let out an awful lot of vinegar, I admit.
And you're going to have Thanksgiving dinner with a lot of these people, too.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Well, there's the Phil Plait talks about the Dalton thing. It's be nice until it's time to not be nice. And there is a point where you sort of have to sort of say, okay, you know what, you're not being fair, and you can get a little bit more aggressive, perhaps. But initially, I think being just nice.
Well, a boyhood chum of mine many years ago in Toronto, Canada, was named Walter Spain, and his parents were interesting folks. One of them was a retired engineer, the male, was a retired engineer who was very grumpy about life because he'd been fired, and he was in private business now. And his wife wore a hearing aids in each ear, and that's in days when it looked like the size of a cucumber stuck in your ear with wires coming out of it, And she had the perfect solution to the whole thing. He'd make an argument with her, and he'd screech and carry on, and she'd say, "So you say." Out they would come, and he knew that he could. All he wanted, and she wasn't hearing a word he was saying. So we don't all have that recourse, unfortunately, but Mrs. Spain had it down.
Randy's comment is actually also a metaphor for the problem a lot of us engage in when we're trying to get through to someone else. Sometimes they just tune us out. They take out their hearing aids, metaphoric hearing aids. And so the question of context is so important. Are we trying to debate someone to change their mind? Are we trying to debate someone to change their minds, or instead to have some fun, right? Martin Gardner, someone a couple of weeks ago shared with me this anecdote. Martin Gardner had a long correspondence with Mario Truzzi, one of the original figures in the skeptics movement. And Truzzi often argued, well, the skeptics are too negative. They're not open-minded enough about the believer's claims, and we should really bend over backwards and explore all these possibilities. I think the best skeptics do, but that was his argument, and he just couldn't believe that sometimes skeptics would deign to make fun of a believer in whatever woo-woo belief. And Martin Gardner said, well, wait a minute, if you're in the letters, if you're not trying to change their mind, but you want to change other people's minds who are listening, the best weapon in that regard is ridicule and poking fun and joshing and that sort of stuff, which I think gives us a bad rap. But it's the context question. Are you trying to change this person's mind? You're trying to change the listener's mind? Or are you just trying to have some fun because you're at a pub gathering and you've had 3 and you want to, butt heads?
There's another point here that should be made, I think, DJ. You say to change people's minds. I don't set out to change people's minds. I'm not that ambitious. I only want to get them to think about what I'm telling them or what I'm suggesting to them or outlining to them. If I can get them thinking, if it goes the right way, and if they are thinking people at all, I think that they will, and I've had them come to me years afterwards and say, you made a big change in my life. You got me thinking about this, and I've turned around. Wow. These are victories that you cherish, believe me. And if you hear only from a few of them, 7 or 8 in a year, and that's about the average that I get like that, then you know that you're reaching a lot more people who don't send you an email or a written letter. In many cases, they are handwritten letters and personally signed from people who think it's that important that they have to tell you you made a change in their lives. But just get them thinking about what you said and ask them to consider it carefully.
That ridicule point is an interesting one, that if you are speaking with someone who is a believer, there might be a common reference point of ridicule, which is a nice avenue to open up a conversation that, you could look at some. I always love when, a believer will talk about Anubis, sadly, they pray to a dog. That's so silly. Oh, excuse me, I have to go drink some blood and eat flesh. But you can sort of, it might be an in, to have a common source of ridicule. And you could say, well, that's not that different from what you think, or there are some aspects of what you believe that are sort of similar. What do you think about that? How is it different? Explain to me how it's different.
There are some things in ridicule you've got to be very careful of. Now, I lecture at colleges and universities all over the world, as I'm sure you know, and I very frequently, meeting with the academics afterwards, they will drop a comment like, these people who believe in all these supernatural and occult things, they must be really stupid. Now, that gives me an open door to walk in and really flail them with it. I say, you have a library here? Or let's go out to the local bookstore. And I do one of my book tests thing. It's a mentalism stunt that usually blows them away, and they're just like fish out of water. And I say, wait a minute. You said people who believed in these things were stupid. Are you stupid? I just fooled you. And they look around, they say, oh, I see your point. And I hope they do see my point. People who believe in the supernatural and the paranormal are not necessarily stupid at all. They're just misinformed. And if you can get them thinking again and give them a different point of view that they may wish to consider, you can win them that way. And when you win them solid, believe me.
Well, I think there are certain cases where ridicule is the exact proper response.
Example.
I have a column coming out in the June Scientific American. Poll from Harris, 24% of Republicans think Obama might be the Antichrist.
Right.
One of the things I say in the column, it's sort of a series of follow-up questions to that 24%. And one of the first questions is, do you consider the fact that you think Obama only might be the Antichrist to be evidence of your scientific outlook?
Example of ridicule, exactly. I agree. Thank you, Steve.
And yet, of that 24%, how many of them hold down jobs and raise families and don't drive their cars off of cliffs?
And vote.
And vote, yeah. But, I mean,
Interestingly, only 22% of the total, and that means fewer than the ones who think that he might be the Antichrist, think that he wants the terrorists to win. So there's a small percentage who think that he might be the Antichrist, but still wants the terrorists to lose. Because the Antichrist is tricky like that.
That's right.
Of course. Of course. I should have seen that.
It's just like the Antichrist.
That's actually one of the lines in the column, because it's just like...
Some good detective work there, Steve. Can we talk a little bit about beliefs that are where people are clinging to them for especially emotional reasons? Because I think that's one of the hardest things to get past when we're arguing with people. It really jumps out at you when you listen to sort of the anti-science or anti-skeptic camps, that how much they play on people's emotions like hope and fear, and that it's just such a powerful force, even if you are trying to think rationally, and especially if you're not. Have you guys developed any ways of sort of getting through that wall?
Well, I've said several times that Sylvia Browne and John Edward have as their best customers and converts people who are grieving, people who have just lost someone dear to them, and they're looking around, they don't quite understand why this happened to them, and if they come under the influence of these so-called psychics and such, they are perfect fodder for those cannons. They really are. They are going to collapse into belief very, very easily, and that's why they head for them. And that's the cruel part of this whole thing of speaking with the dead. It is a cruel farce, and it's something that gives me such a bad taste every time I see it or experience it or am referred to it. It's really a nasty aspect to this whole thing, and it's one of the reasons for my existence, and I hope for the existence of many people sitting in this audience.
I think you have to know when to dive into those really heavy emotional things. If you're dealing with someone who's lost a loved one, it might not be the best time to start talking about the afterlife or things like that. Now, if they're spending thousands of dollars talking to a fraud, then it's almost your duty to at least present the possibilities of what they're doing is not the best use of their money. But again, you're not going to be able to. It's such a tenuous position to be put into. I had a listener of my show call in and said his neighbor lost his wife and daughter. I think it was a horrible accident, and this guy now was he was bringing people into his house, spending all kinds of money on psychics, and they wanted to talk with the. And he said, "What do I do?" And I said, "There's only so much you can do. You know, you have to realize that the weight of what has transpired is so massive that to be able to say, oh, that person you're paying, that's bullshit. It's such a delicate situation.
But more importantly than the money, George, is the emotional dependence.
Absolutely,
because the money is only one thing. Many people can afford that kind of money, and it doesn't cost them anything emotionally. But if they get them emotionally and get them locked into this belief in the supernatural and survival after death and such, that's the danger of the thing.
And yet there's sometimes when people can feel a certain sense of connection. I mean, I think it's grief raping is what it is, which is horrible. But there is some relief that people do feel sometimes, thinking that there's something beyond. Yeah. And it would be very difficult for me to wag my finger and say there's nothing.
You got to be very careful.
So
very
it's a
selective.
balance.
There's another kind of argument that I feel is true and yet tends to go over very poorly with people. It came up during the podcast, Randy, when you were talking about hallucinations and about the neurological basis of near-death experiences. Basically, all the ways that our brains play tricks on us. So this includes less eerie phenomena too, like just selective memory, when you remember the hits and forget the misses. But I just find that people tend to really bridle when you say something like that, because what they hear is, oh, it's all in your head, or you're imagining it, and that seems both insulting and also implausible to them. Do you have trouble making this argument, or is there any way you sort of make it more
convincing to people?
Well, I would not use the expression "it's all in your head."
Oh no, I'm just saying I think that's what they hear.
Yeah. That's the impression they get from what you've said.
Right.
But you've got to be very careful. You've got to be very politic, very sensitive. That covers it pretty well to what their needs are. You can't disappoint them. You can't fly in their face. You've got to be. You'd be amazed. Though I look like the curmudgeon of all time, I make Andy Rooney look like an amateur when it comes to that. Not for the eyebrows, but certainly being curmudgeonly. But believe me, I have sat with so many people, with families, entire families, sitting in the library at the James Randi Educational Foundation, and have to discuss how do we talk mom out of giving all the money to the spiritualists or to the healers or whatever. And I don't really have a very good answer for them, except be gentle, be kind, try to be understanding, and wait till the big impact of the loss of a loved one is essentially, well, maybe never over, but essentially over, or at least on its downside of taking advantage of these people. Just be gentle and be kind and be understanding. Do a lot of handshaking and shoulder grasping and whatnot. That's important. You can't come out as the nasty curmudgeon. You really can't.
In terms of it's all in your head, or going back to that idea of what people witness and how they swear that they could, they felt it, they heard it, they saw it, they were there. Show a couple Richard Weissman videos. The dribbling gorilla that walks through the crowd. I'm sure most of you have seen this thing, right? Where it's people, there are people, your job is to count how many times 6 or 7 basketball players toss a ball to each other. Count the number of times the white shirts throw the ball back and forth. And you sit there and you count and you count and you count. And it's like, yeah, I'm going to get this. This is easy. I'm going to get this. And the video finishes. And then you go back and you rewind. And now they say, now just watch it without watching it, without counting. And of course, the same exact video you watch, and a gorilla walks through the scene and kind of waves and walks out. And you go, like, and if you had, like they said earlier in one of the panels, if you had been taken to court, did you see a gorilla walk through that scene? No, Your Honor, I swear I did not see a gorilla walk. And you would be right in your mind.
But the trouble is, George, they don't believe that's the same video.
I know, there's that too, right.
Second time.
Right.
And for good reason. They just simply did not see the damn gorilla.
But it does open up that possibility of,
yes,
here's what's happening right in front of you. What else is happening right in front of you where you would swear that thing happened or didn't happen?
Now, go ahead.
I was just going to, we were talking about 2 different strategies right here because we're talking about 2 different sets of beliefs. So Randi was talking about the beliefs that hit you where you live and breathe. You believe in ghosts because you have a deceased loved one and you saw your grandfather with whom you're very close downstairs in the chilly part of the basement, okay? And you're talking about maybe someone, maybe a less central belief, a less foundational belief that you can show a video or talk about cognitive distortions or mental biases or something. Each strategy works for the different kinds of beliefs we're talking about. The point I want to make is kind of going back to some of the things I said in my remarks this morning, which is when skeptics realize that almost every single thing we're skeptical about is not just a goofy, funny thing to, enjoy that people believe. Yeah. But that we're talking about the most basic and most fundamental beliefs that people have that make sense out of the universe for most people. Psychics, we might say, well, come on, I don't want a fake psychic to harm people, and maybe that's why we're in it. But some people believe in psychics because of the implications of psychic powers. If psychic powers are real, that is incredibly comforting. J.B. Rhine, when he started out in his research, he was a naturalist at first at University of Chicago, and he thought about the implications of science and evolution, and he realized, my gosh, this means that when you're dead, and I don't like that. And so he switched his whole research trajectory into trying to prove that psychic powers exist. Why? Because if you could prove that minds can communicate with minds, then you prove mind-body dualism, and that suggests that people survive death. And that's where most believers are coming from, really central issues, not just trivial, goofy stuff you see on should I say the Science Channel, one of the cable channels that's not really, History Channel's not really about history. It's about Bigfoot a lot, so, yeah.
And Arthur Conan Doyle and Bishop Pike and many other persons of great intellect actually fell for this sort of thing. They lost loved ones in the war, in both those cases, as a matter of fact, and they turned around on their heels right away and began to believe in woo-woo material and were completely committed to it, completely.
Even Alfred Russell Wallace,
Exactly, yes.
co-discoverer of evolutionary theory,
That's right.
fell for that.
Yeah.
Which also raises the issue that when you are put into a situation of great stress, it's your job to be vigilant and to be okay with reality, because it's very tempting often to have thoughts of, oh well, I'm unlucky.
Well,
Or
how
that,
often,
that kind of stuff. let
how
alone
often do I
death.
get this comment? Reality, you're over-obsessed with reality. One woman in the audience during one of my talks, after I finished the talk and I threw it open to questions, and she stood up and she asked me a question, and I gave her what I believed, and the audience believed, to be a very satisfactory and rational answer for the thing. And I thanked her, and she sat down. Then she immediately stood up again. She said, "Mr. Randi, I think I know what your problem is." Well, I'm always interested in knowing that too. And so I said, "Indeed, and what would that be?" She said, "You're over-obsessed with reality." I've never forgotten that. Think about that, over-obsessed with reality. And the audience laughed and applauded. She thought they were applauding for her comment. They were laughing at her and applauding for me. That's the way I interpreted it, at least. Over-obsessed with, you can't be over-obsessed with reality, in my estimation.
Okay, so this is another sector of people that I'm interested in your approach to. People who just off the bat deny the validity of logic or reason or evidence in reaching truth. Are they a lost cause, or is there some other approach?
Is it postmodernist academics? Is that who you're talking about?
Exactly. Yeah. True. Very true.
You make them watch Tim Minchin's Storm.
Yeah, well said.
Just to get a little bit of just a little bit of a thing there.
Maybe is there some way to show them that they use logic and reason in other arenas and they're not actually.
Oh, people can be divided like that. They can be very rational on one point of view. And I know scientists who follow the scientific method, and yet they will come up with the craziest beliefs about some other things. And not even because a PhD wrote it up in a scientific paper, but just because they sort of like the idea. And they'll look at you and they'll say, well, that's true. It hasn't been proven, but I really want it to be that way. Duh. And this is a scientific mind. I find that hard to believe. But you get it all the time from scientists.
Mm-hmm. So on that point, if I'm engaging someone who is emphatic that you're too logical, you're being too reasonable, my gosh, you're too in your head, or whatever that charge is, I think a strategy to engage that person, or a radical skeptic of all knowledge, a postmodernist, say, who thinks maybe that science is just a mythic narrative like any other view, I instead like to talk about it in terms of skepticism being like intellectual self-defense. In other words, to engage self-interest, that it's not about me telling her that she's wrong, but instead about kind of helping or trying to persuade her that it's in her own best interest to kick the tires of the car before she buys it, to look under the hood, that it's a kind of intellectual self-defense. When talking to young children about this, about science and reason and critical thinking, a way to frame it, that a word picture that they really get, is that it's intellectual karate. It's a way to kind of keep someone else from pulling one over on you. And so this consumer protection kind of way to talk about it, I think it makes sense to even the radical skeptic of all knowledge. Because if someone says, well, truth, that's just a compliment that you give to ideas that work for you. Then you say, well, it's not in your best interest really to believe that if you think that the truth, the brute facticity of gravity, that when you jump off the building, you'll go splat, that's a self-interest argument, that it's in her best interest to maybe look into these claims.
The truth of the brake pedal.
Yeah.
It's a very similar thing. I always ask people, well, how do you have the courage to get on an airplane? If you think, just in literary theory, if you think that the text can be deconstructed of the manual of the airplane, how do you have the courage to get on there? Or if you think that what really keeps it up is the group belief that the thing is going to fly, wouldn't you like to really poll all the other members of the flight before you get on there to make sure that their belief is really good, that their chi is really strong?
And yet Isaac Asimov was deadly afraid of flying, and he admitted to me and to so many other people, I know that the chances of an accident happening are much less than being out in a bus or on a car on the highway or on a train. He said, but I know that the plane I get on is going to fall down. and this is Isaac Asimov now, mind you. Wow. But he believed that, and he would not fly. That's all there is to
That's
it.
one of those, when Neil deGrasse Tyson gave the keynote at TAM 6, I think it was, he talked about percentages of scientists, people with PhDs, leading scientists in their field in terms of how the belief in religious belief and woo belief lowers sort of the more prestigious you get in terms of your place in science. And yet there's still 3 to 4% that believe in God or whatever questionable belief that there might be. And he said, that's the number you should be interested in looking at and studying. I'm wording this very poorly, but he said that number, that 3% of people that have PhDs that believe in a Christian God, that's the number you should be. Why? What's going on there? And that was a very fascinating kind of thing to think of. This is a obviously rational person who is very intelligent, and yet they might have some kind of belief system that is impervious to the system of rational thinking. Why is that? It sort of addresses that same idea.
Before we go to questions, I wanted to ask about the label skeptic, whether you think that helps or hurts us in trying to persuade people. I can see it potentially helping us just in that being public about labeling ourselves skeptics makes people come to us to ask us about things, and so then it seems less like we're actually attacking someone else's viewpoint or just responding. But then, of course, people might think, they might be more inclined to discount what we say because, he's a skeptic, of course he's going to say that. What do you think?
You don't get to pick your nickname. I've said this before. Anyone who picks their own nickname, you don't want to have anything to do with. So call me Ace. No, I'm not going to call you Ace. So we are skeptics. My personal thing is we are skeptics. Embrace it. The same way that other sections of society had names called and they embraced those names, whether it was queer or whatever it is, you sort of say, yeah, that's what I am. I'm a skeptic. I think that's, we don't get to pick. Just go with it. That's sort of my approach.
Great. Okay, I think we've time for a few.
Sorry, I didn't mean to be the last thing. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, on that point, I was looking. I know you have an opinion about the term skeptic. Well, then I'll say I don't think it was a nickname given us, but I really enjoy the word skeptic much more than most any other term that can describe our mind view, because it's comprehensive and properly understood. I mean, if you have to spend 10 minutes to explain to someone what it means, then that's a downside. But skeptic means something, and it's a noble tradition in the history of the Western in Western intellectual thought. Skepticism means something, and you don't need to run if you're not being chased. And most people don't say skepticism means bad. Now, they do say atheism means bad, right? I don't think skepticism is in the same category.
And always specify skeptic does not mean cynic.
Yeah.
That's an important difference to make.
Great. Okay, we've got time for a few questions. I think we've got a line. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I very much appreciated the panels today, but I'm very troubled. I'm a psychologist and a psychoanalyst, and I don't think there's been enough discussion here about emotions. Everybody is talking about the cortex, about being smart, about rational thought, about belief system. Most people live in their limbic system. Most people have an irrational side. I do believe in an unconscious, and I think there's been a few very gentle nods toward emotion. Even someone like Asimov can be very bright, very thoughtful, but he's phobic. He has fears of being, out of control. He doesn't want to fly. I think it's really, really important for those of us that are skeptics to be able to acknowledge that emotions play an enormous part in everybody's life. And when you're talking to anybody, you need to find out where their emotional center is.
And in rational thought. Your emotional life informs your ability to think rationally and to exist as a rational being.
Well, it's very important, but I do think, I say to my patients, you're entitled to your feelings, but feelings aren't facts. But I do acknowledge feelings, and I challenge people in this room to acknowledge feelings, too.
Well, I think when we were speaking of grief, we were talking about that. Understanding context is, in fact, understanding where people are at emotionally. If my grandmother is on her deathbed, that's not the time to engage about whether or not she believes in reincarnation or the salvific power of Jesus and going to heaven. I think there was a nod, at least, maybe more than a nod, to people's emotional states. I'm persuaded that even rationalists and skeptics are often much more emotional than they are rational. And our rationality makes sense out of our emotions. They're slaves to our emotions much more than the other way around. I liked your talking about the functionalism of the brain, right? The limbic system, or the kind of how our brains are, these kludges and have evolved in very messy ways, and that we have all this leftover stuff from evolution. That's a great entree, by the way, in engaging on skepticism, to let someone know that their mental traps and their cognitive biases, the problems that all of us have in thinking things through, well, it's evolved, and there are ways to kind of sort them out. But you got to know about them first. I think that's an entree.
I think that's my point, that there's a differentiated way of talking about feelings, so thank you.
Yeah, emotions can conquer logic in many cases, and in most cases, I would say. But I got to tell you, again, getting away from the curmudgeon scene that I have been connected with all of these years, I lied to my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, who I greatly loved and admired. He was sort of my role model. And the only thing I lied to him on was on his deathbed. And he looked at me sort of wanly, and he knew he was dying. He had hours to live, literally. And he said, "Randy, do you think that I'm going to meet Janie?" That was his wife, who had died a few years before. And I looked him straight in the eye and I said, "Yes, Gramps, I think you will. And I think that it will be a joyous reunion." I lied. I didn't have any such notion that he was going to meet Janie. Not at all. But I lied because it gave him great comfort. And he smiled at me in the strangest way. And I don't know, to this day, I will never know, of course, whether he believed that I was telling him what I was really feeling or not. I suspect he didn't, because he was a smart guy.
There's that beautiful sequence from The Invention of Lying. I don't know if you've seen that film, where it's a Ricky Gervais film, and it's a universe where there is no lying except for Ricky Gervais, and his mom is it's that exact sequence.
Yeah.
And he realizes that he can lie and provide comfort in her last moments. It's a beautiful scene, and check it out if you haven't seen it. It's really well done.
Next question.
I've noticed that a lot of the girls I attempt to date believe wholeheartedly in psychic powers, ghosts, seeing fairies, and other things. And I've noticed since I was younger, telling them straight out, "Well, I think that's all bogus," guarantees not getting another phone call. So, one of the reasons I realized I was a skeptic. Why aren't they calling me back?
That's one of the dangers of skepticism.
Yeah. How do I engage? Like, let's say I'm in the middle of dinner. I try to weasel this out beforehand, but how do you possibly date someone that you like if their belief system is totally, completely out of whack, convinced that there's ghosts in their apartment, that there's psychic powers?
Why do you like them?
I don't know that beforehand. You don't know that beforehand.
Well, that's part of the process, man. It's like, wow, you're really attractive. Oh, wait, you're talking. Okay.
Yeah, the problem is the ones I
say-
like to look at tend to believe all that crazy stuff, and the ones that don't believe the crazy stuff, we tend to have nothing else in common with.
You just say, shh, don't ruin the moment. Shh.
That's right.
I'm gonna go with that. Thank you.
One more. Sorry, guys.
Wait, is he saying the girls here aren't good looking? But no, I have a question. Like with regards to when you're talking about the joy of kind of winning an argument, like particularly with that example you gave of the woman on the ship who came one day and said, I realize everything is wrong. Isn't there kind of a flip side to that where you could actually almost feel kind of bad when you win the argument? You say, she says that, you say, yeah, I am right, but please don't jump off the stern of the ship. I mean, the past 10 years of your life, I'm sure, were not a complete waste. And because, it does hurt people a lot sometimes to let go of their beliefs. How do you deal with that? Could you be reassuring to them or try to, not feel like a complete ass for taking away their reason to live?
Well, I hadn't argued with the lady. I had only discussed this with the audience that I had in front of me, and she had been part of that audience. But, and I didn't set out to argue with her on the thing, pro and con, but what I said got through to her. And that's part of the art, is being able to introduce it as a sort of a blanket fog over the whole audience there, that skepticism and rationality is a sensible way to go about it. Think about that, folks, and then say your goodbyes. And it worked with this lady, but she didn't feel affronted by it. I hadn't addressed anything to her. Oh, that's a stupid thing. Why did you think of that? No, I never do that, and I have not done that. And that's one of the reasons that I won this lady.
Right. On that point, I think you're, you vanished, but I think the questioner is really pointing out some of the perils of argumentation. So I went to Bible college, and I was a true believer, and I remember being a scold as a religious person and finding all the other guys in my dorm who didn't believe the truth about God, and I remember staying up in the laundry room and just really arguing it out. I was a good little cult member, Christian apologist, right? And I'm no longer there. But, yeah. A person I've stayed in touch with was kind of a lukewarm backpedaler, not religious person at Bible college, but over the course of many conversations, he became religious, and he is to this day very religious. And so what, do you go back to people and say, by the way, I got that whole thing wrong, right? So there's a danger in argumentation. You just damn well better be sure that you're on the right side. Right?
And yet, I think all of us have had experiences where we meet people that have had that epiphany moment, and some of them start slowly, and there's a realization of, okay, when I die, that's it. And there's a sadness, but I think over time, I know people have told me this again and again and again, they realize that the universe actually opens up to you.
Yes.
And the worldview totally changes, and that you can almost say, it might not feel like it, but your adventure is beginning. This is where it gets really cool.
Yeah.
And that is something you can relate, so that maybe in the moment they get crushed because, that thing I've been doing for 10 years is not actually true. But you say, okay, but there's so much more. And it's all real. And you get to live in that moment of reality. Yeah, the added benefit of truth. And it just gets better. Just hold on to your hat.
And a great example of that, George, is Michael Shermer. You all know Michael Shermer, don't we all? Yes, let's hear it from Michael Shermer. Yes. A very close colleague and a dear friend, I assure you. But he has an advantage over myself and over many of us. Now, DJ has the same advantage. At one point, he was a fundamentalist Christian until he got into college. And about the first year into college, he looked at himself in the mirror one day, and he got an epiphany. And he said, wait a minute. And he switched around completely. He has the advantage, ladies and gentlemen, that many of you may have, as a matter of fact, of having once been in the fold, as DJ was, in the fold, total believer in everything, and then coming out of that. These people understand better than I do and better than I ever can what it's like to do the switch from one to the other. And they tend to be more sympathetic and kinder in their approach in trying to inform people to the contrary. So that's an angle of superiority that DJ and Michael Shermer, there are many others too, but that they have over me. I never had that experience. When I was that tall, I was asking questions in Sunday school. It shows you how bad I am.
Thanks, guys. We're gonna wrap it up and move on. Let's give a hand to our panelists.
Thank you, Julia, Steve, George, DJ, and Randy.